What if the most famous bite of an apple, taken thousands of years ago, still echoed through the lives of real women in 1212? What if an ancient story, whispered through generations, shaped everything from their legal rights to their very bodies? What if the original sin wasn't just a distant historical event, but a living, breathing shadow haunting the everyday existence of women in the heart of the Middle Ages? Number 1. The shadow of childbirth and pain. Imagine a woman in a humble village, perhaps near the bustling market town of St. Albans in the year 1212. Her name might be Alara, and she is in labor. The air is thick with the scent of herbs and fear, a palpable dread that settles over every room where a new life is struggling to be born. For Alara and her sisters in the medieval world, childbirth was not merely a physical ordeal. It was a profound spiritual and theological one, directly linked to the ancient story of Eve. The Bible in the book of Genesis explicitly states the divine decree after Eve's transgression: "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." This single verse was not a metaphor to medieval minds. It was a literal, undeniable truth, an explanation for the excruciating pain and ever-present danger that accompanied every delivery. The theological framework was simple yet devastatingly effective. Women suffered in childbirth as a direct punishment for Eve's disobedience. Her sin, by bringing death and suffering into the world, was understood to have cursed all women with this agonizing burden. This belief was deeply ingrained, taught from pulpits, discussed in households, and reinforced by the sheer brutality of the birthing process itself. There were no pain relievers, no sophisticated medical interventions, and mortality rates for both mother and child were staggeringly high. A woman might endure hours, even days, of agonizing labor, often with little more than a midwife's experienced hands and the prayers of her family. If she died, as many did, it was not just a tragic accident, but in some interpretations, the ultimate fulfillment of that ancient curse. Consider the psychological weight this placed upon a pregnant woman. Every contraction was a reminder of Eve's fall, every scream a confirmation of humanity's corrupted nature. It transformed a natural biological process into a penitential act, a spiritual penance that women alone were forced to endure. The Church, through its teachings, reinforced this idea, often encouraging women to accept their suffering as a form of purification, a way to atone for the original sin that they, as daughters of Eve, inherited. Popular devotional texts and sermons from the period, while often emphasizing Mary's purity as a counterpoint, still underscored the general pain associated with women's bodies and their reproductive capacity. The very act of bringing forth new life was steeped in the shadow of death and divine retribution. Midwives, the primary caregivers during childbirth, were often women of great experience and skill, but their knowledge was empirical and limited by the understanding of the age. They might employ herbal remedies or rituals, but they were ultimately powerless against many complications. Birth was prolonged or difficult. It could be seen not just as a physical challenge, but as a spiritual one, perhaps even a sign of the mother's own unconfessed sins, adding another layer of terror to an already desperate situation. Communal aspect of childbirth, with women gathering to support the laboring mother, offered some comfort, but it also shared the collective awareness of the suffering and the theological explanation behind it. The shared experience of pain became a shared understanding of Eve's legacy, a common bond forged in the crucible of agony and fear. 1212, for every woman like Alara, the pangs of labor were not just physical sensations, they were echoes of a forbidden fruit, a reminder that the world had fallen, and that her body bore the most intimate, painful mark of that ancient sin. Number 2, the stigma of menstruation and impurity. Imagine the young girl, perhaps named Agnes, growing up in a prosperous merchant household in a town like London or Winchester in 1212. As she approaches adolescence, she is taught, subtly and not so subtly, about the natural cycles of her body. These lessons are not just about biology, they are steeped in a pervasive sense of impurity and a theological burden, directly linking menstruation to Eve's original sin. Medieval medicine and theology, deeply intertwined, viewed the female body as inherently more susceptible to corruption and physical weakness than the male, and menstrual blood was often seen as a primary manifestation of this inherent flaw. This belief had deep roots in ancient traditions, but it was heavily reinforced by Christian theology. The idea was that the female body, due to Eve's sin, was less perfect, more prone to decay, and that menstruation was a physical purging of impurities or even the superfluity of blood that could not be adequately cooked or processed into life-giving seed, as was believed of the male body. This was not just a biological process, it was imbued with moral and spiritual significance. A woman was considered ritually unclean during her menstrual period, and this perception could affect her participation in religious life and social interactions. While the New Testament generally moved away from the extreme purity laws of ancient Judaism, the medieval church, influenced by various patristic writings and developing theological traditions, often retained a sense of ritual impurity around menstruation. During her period, a woman might be discouraged or even forbidden from receiving communion, entering certain sacred spaces, or performing certain domestic tasks, particularly those involving food preparation in some stricter interpretations. While the rules varied and were not universally enforced with the same rigor, the underlying belief in female ritual impurity was widespread. This meant that a natural bodily function became a source of shame, a marker of difference, and a constant reminder of the fallen nature of womanhood. A woman's body, by its very cyclical nature, was seen as a vehicle for the continuing effects of Eve's sin, prone to leakage, flux, and a form of defilement. Physicians and scholars of the time, such as those influenced by the medical texts of Hippocrates and Galen, interpreted menstruation through this lens, believing it to be a necessary purging of excess humors or corrupting substances. While they sought physiological explanations, these were almost always layered with moral and theological implications. The female body was seen as less stable, more prone to illness and imbalance because of this inherent impurity. This view contributed to a general understanding of women as physically weaker and more delicate, requiring protection and control, not just for their own good, but for the moral purity of the community. Agnes and countless others, navigating adolescence and womanhood, meant confronting this deeply ingrained stigma. Learning about her body meant internalizing a message that a part of her natural self was unclean, a perpetual sign of Eve's ancient mistake. It was a silent burden, often unspoken but deeply felt, shaping her self-perception and her place within the spiritual and social order of 1212. This constant reminder of an inherited impurity, linked directly to the actions of the first woman, reinforced the pervasive idea that womanhood itself was tainted by sin, a condition from which one could only seek purification through strict adherence to religious norms, and often through the suffering of childbirth. Number 3, the justification for subordination and male authority. Imagine the household of a knight, perhaps Sir Reginald, in a fortified manor in the English countryside in 1212. His wife, Lady Eleanor, runs the domestic affairs with quiet efficiency, manages the servants, oversees the children's education, and even helps manage the estates when Sir Reginald is away. Yet despite her undeniable competence and often extensive responsibilities, her position within the household and society was fundamentally one of subordination, a truth deeply rooted in the theological understanding of Eve's original sin. Christian doctrine held that Adam was created first, and Eve was created from his rib as a helper. Her subsequent disobedience, leading to the fall, was interpreted as a grave act of rebellion against both God and, implicitly, against the natural order established with Adam as the head. This narrative provided a powerful theological justification for male authority over women. St. Paul's epistles, particularly passages like, "Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. For Adam was first formed, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression," were taken as divine commandments. These texts were not just abstract theological ideas, they were the bedrock of social organization in 1212. They were preached from every pulpit, taught in every monastic school, and internalized by men and women alike. This meant that even capable women like Lady Eleanor, who might effectively govern an entire manor, were still seen as requiring the ultimate oversight and guidance of a male figure, whether her husband, father, or a male guardian. Her authority was delegated, not inherent. This permeated all levels of society. In legal matters, a woman's testimony might be viewed with more suspicion than a man's, and she often needed a male guardian to represent her interests in court. In marriage, the husband was unequivocally considered the head of the household, with duties to protect and provide, but also with the right to command and, in some cases, to discipline. The disobedience of Eve to God, and by extension to Adam, became the model for what was considered proper wifely submission. The idea was that woman, being the weaker vessel and more susceptible to temptation, as demonstrated by Eve, needed the stronger, more rational guidance of man to prevent further sin and maintain order. This belief was not intended to be cruel, but rather, from the medieval perspective, a divinely ordained hierarchy for the good of all. It was understood as a protection for women themselves, shielding them from their own inherent flaws and preventing them from leading men astray. This paternalistic view, however, effectively limited women's autonomy and decision-making power in public life, even while they might hold significant influence within the domestic sphere. For Alina, her daily life in 1212 would be a constant negotiation of this reality. Her intelligence and capabilities were probably recognized by those around her, but they would always be viewed through the lens of her being a woman, a daughter of Eve. Piety, her domestic skills, her ability to manage complex affairs, all were admirable, but they were ultimately exercised within a framework of male authority, a structure explained and justified by that ancient story of a forbidden fruit and a woman's fatal choice. The lingering echo of Eve's transgression meant that her every achievement, her every contribution, was understood within a system that fundamentally saw her as secondary, always in need of a guiding hand. Number 4, exclusion from power and priesthood. Imagine a young woman, perhaps named Juliana, living in a devout family in a thriving city like Paris in 1212. She feels a deep spiritual calling, a yearning to serve God, to dedicate her life to the church. For a medieval woman, this path often led to the convent, a place of learning, prayer, and community. But a higher calling, the priesthood, was utterly closed off to her, a barrier largely fortified by the lingering shadow of Eve's original sin. While women could become revered abbesses, managing vast monastic estates and wielding significant spiritual authority within their own communities, they could never celebrate the Mass, hear confessions, or administer sacraments in the way a priest could. This was not a mere custom, it was a deeply ingrained theological principle. Core argument against female ordination rested heavily on the interpretation of Eve's role in the fall. Since Eve was deceived first and then led Adam into sin, women were seen as inherently more susceptible to deception and less capable of rational, authoritative spiritual leadership. This was reinforced by the New Testament injunctions, particularly St. Paul's directive against women teaching or having authority over men in the church. Priesthood was understood to represent Christ, who was male, and therefore it was argued only a male could embody this representation during the Mass, especially in the act of transubstantiation. Priest was considered in persona Christi, in the person of Christ, a role women were deemed unfit to fulfill due to their inherited susceptibility to sin, tracing back directly to Eve. Church fathers, whose writings formed the bedrock of medieval theology, frequently reiterated this stance. Tullian, for example, famously addressed women, "You are the devil's gateway, you are the unsealer of that forbidden tree, you are the first deserter of the divine law, you are she who persuaded him whom the devil was not valiant enough to attack. You destroyed so easily God's image, man." While this is an extreme example, the underlying sentiment, that women were inherently more prone to sin and deception due to Eve's actions, was pervasive and directly impacted their exclusion from positions of spiritual authority. For Juliana, this meant that her spiritual aspirations, no matter how profound, would always hit a glass ceiling. She could pray, she could fast, she could dedicate her life to God in a convent, she could even be a visionary mystic whose revelations were highly valued, but she could not stand at the altar and perform the central mystery of the Christian faith. This exclusion was not just about ritual, it was about power, authority, and the fundamental capacity to mediate between God and humanity. By denying women the priesthood, the Church effectively curtailed their direct influence over the spiritual lives of the wider community, reserving that sacred power for men, who were considered less susceptible to the weaknesses inherited from Eve. In 1212, as the Church solidified its doctrines and prepared for momentous events like the Fourth Lateran Council just a few years later, these exclusions became even more firmly entrenched. The image of the ideal priest was one of moral and intellectual strength, a figure who could guide and protect the faithful, a role that was, by definition, considered incompatible with the perceived weaknesses and inherent sinfulness attributed to women because of Eve's original transgression. Thus, the shadow of Eve's ancient choice stretched long and wide, defining the boundaries of spiritual possibility for every woman like Juliana, channeling their piety into paths that, while sometimes influential, would never lead to the altar. Number 5. The burden of blame for lust and temptation. Imagine a young man, perhaps a scholar named Thomas, studying at a nascent university in Oxford or Bologna in 1212. He is immersed in philosophical and theological debates, grappling with the complexities of human nature and sin. A recurring theme in these discussions, and in the sermons he hears, is the concept of temptation, and almost inevitably, the blame for lust and carnal sin is laid squarely at the feet of women, a direct consequence of Eve's original role as temptress. This wasn't just about Eve tempting Adam with the apple. It was about a broader perception that women, by their very nature and their physical allure, were the primary instigators of male sin, particularly sexual sin. The narrative of Eve tempting Adam established a powerful archetype, the woman as the seducer, the one who leads man astray from righteousness. This was not just a historical event in the Garden of Eden. It became a pervasive psychological and theological lens through which all interactions between men and women were viewed. Men in this framework were often seen as rational and moral beings who were nonetheless vulnerable to the allure of the female form, which post-fall was understood to be inherently seductive and dangerous. This perception was reinforced by various theological texts and popular stories that depicted women as inherently lustful or as instruments of the devil. This belief had profound implications for how women were expected to present themselves and behave in 1212. Modesty in dress, demeanor, and speech was not just a virtue. It was seen as a necessary safeguard, not primarily for a woman's own purity, but to protect men from their own sinful urges. A woman who was immodestly dressed or behaved in a way considered overtly flirtatious was seen as not only committing a sin herself, but more importantly, as causing men to sin. The burden of male temptation was placed upon her shoulder. If a man succumbed to lust, it was often attributed to the woman's seductive power rather than his own lack of self-control. This blame extended beyond individual interactions. In legal and moral discourse, discussions of prostitution, adultery, and other sexual transgressions often placed significant emphasis on the woman's role in inciting the sin. While men were certainly held accountable for their actions, the narrative often framed women as the primary instigators, or even the gateway to sin, echoing Eve's ancient role. This created a paradoxical situation where women were simultaneously objectified as sources of temptation and condemned for being that sort. For women in 1212, this meant navigating a world where their bodies and their very presence could be seen as a moral hazard to men. It led to stricter social controls, demands for greater modesty, and a pervasive societal pressure to conform to an ideal of demureness and humility. The lingering echo of Eve's original temptation meant that a woman's beauty, her charm, her very femaleness could be viewed with suspicion, not as a gift, but as a potential trap, a dangerous instrument that could lead men, and thus humanity, away from salvation. The shadow of Eve, the temptress, cast a long and often unfair judgment on the women of the medieval world, holding them accountable not just for their own actions, but for the moral failings of men. Number 6. Restrictions on education and intellectual pursuits. Imagine a bright young woman, perhaps named Marguerite, living in a prosperous urban center like Florence or Cologne in 1212. She possesses a keen mind, a thirst for knowledge, and a natural curiosity about the world around her. While some women, particularly those in wealthy households or in convents, did receive education, her access to formal intellectual pursuits was significantly curtailed, often influenced by the pervasive belief that women, due to Eve's original sin and her subsequent deception, were intellectually inferior or that extensive knowledge could lead them astray. The story of Eve, who was deceived by the serpent and then tempted Adam, was often interpreted as a cautionary tale about female intellectual vulnerability. Belief was that women were more easily swayed, less capable of rigorous logic, and more susceptible to error, not just in matters of faith but in general understanding. This contributed to the idea that complex intellectual pursuits were better suited for men, whose rationality was seen as superior and less easily corrupted. While women were encouraged to learn piety, household management, and perhaps basic literacy to read religious texts, access to higher learning, such as theology, law, or medicine, was largely denied to them. Universities, which were flourishing centers of learning in 1212, were exclusively male domains. Curriculum focused heavily on scholastic theology, canon law, and medicine, disciplines that required extensive Latin knowledge, logical reasoning, and engagement with complex philosophical arguments. The very structure of these institutions reflected the belief that such intellectual endeavors were the preserve of men. Female scholars, if they existed outside of convents, were extremely rare exceptions and often faced significant barriers to recognition and acceptance. Even within convents, where women could achieve high levels of literacy and sometimes engage in significant intellectual work, the emphasis was typically on spiritual texts, devotional literature, and the practical management of the monastic community. While some abbesses were highly educated and ran important scriptoria or libraries, the formal intellectual pursuits available to nuns generally differed from those open to male clergy or scholars. The ultimate goal of female education was often seen as fostering piety and domestic virtue, rather than fostering independent critical thought or challenging established doctrines. This meant that for someone like Marguerite, her intellectual curiosity would largely have to be satisfied through private reading, informal instruction, or the limited libraries available to her. She might learn to read and write in the vernacular, possibly even some Latin, but the doors to advanced scholarship, public debate, or systematic intellectual inquiry were largely closed. The shadow of Eve's deception and the subsequent theological understanding of female intellectual frailty cast a long constraint over women's access to knowledge. It reinforced the idea that women were to be guided, not to lead intellectually, and that their minds, like their bodies, were prone to weakness and the danger of leading humanity astray, echoing the ancient fall from grace. The original sin thus served as a theological justification for a system that limited women's intellectual horizons, effectively keeping them from positions of academic influence and public discourse in the medieval world of 1212. Number 7. Legal disadvantages and property rights. Imagine a widow, perhaps named Isolde, living in a town like York or Rouen in 1212. Her husband, a merchant, has recently died, and she is left with children and a substantial amount of property. Despite her competence and her husband's success, Isolde finds herself navigating a complex legal landscape where her rights to property, inheritance, and legal agency are significantly diminished, largely due to the pervasive societal and legal interpretations of Eve's original sin and the subsequent theological justification for female subordination. Medieval law, particularly customary law and developing common law in places like England, was heavily influenced by Roman law, Germanic traditions, and canon law from the Church. All these systems, to varying degrees, placed women in a legally inferior position to men. The idea that women were the weaker sex, more prone to deception, and less capable of rational decision-making, echoing Eve's transgression, translated into tangible legal disadvantages. In many regions, a woman was considered under the legal guardianship of a male throughout her life. As a daughter, she was under her father's potestas or authority. Upon marriage, she typically became subsumed under her husband's legal identity, a concept often referred to as femme covert, covered woman. This meant that a married woman often could not own property independently, enter into contracts, or initiate legal proceedings without her husband's consent or co-signature. While she might bring a dower or marriage portion to the marriage, control over these assets often passed to her husband. Upon his death, a widow like Isolde might be entitled to a dower right, typically a third of her husband's lands for her lifetime, but she did not necessarily gain full control over all his property, which often passed to male heirs. Her ability to participate in legal proceedings was also limited. A woman's testimony in court might be viewed with more skepticism than a man's, and she often needed a male prochin ami, next friend, or guardian to represent her interests in legal disputes. This was not because women were inherently mistrusted, but because the prevailing belief, stemming from the Eve narrative, was that they were more easily deceived and therefore less reliable as independent legal actors. The law reflected the theological conviction that women needed male oversight and protection, not just for their own good, but for the stability of society. For Isolde, this meant that even as a widow, ostensibly freed from her husband's direct control, she would still face significant limitations. Managing her late husband's business or land might require her to navigate complex legal hurdles, seek male counsel, or even surrender significant control to male relatives or guardians. She might have to secure a legal guardian for her children, even if she was perfectly capable of raising them, because the law often privileged male guardianship. Concept of her original sin by lineage, the idea that all women carried the legacy of Eve's mistake, thus played out in the practical realities of land tenure, inheritance laws, and legal agency in 1212. The very structures designed to protect wealth and lineage were also, implicitly and explicitly, designed to limit the independent legal power of women, reflecting a deeply ingrained societal belief in their inherent vulnerability and their need for male supervision, a vulnerability directly linked to the first woman's fall. Number 8. The cultural construction of female beauty and modesty. Imagine a vibrant street seen in a bustling city like Venice or Ghent in 1212. Women walk by, adorned in their finest clothes, perhaps a simple tunic and cloak for a commoner, or richly embroidered gowns for the nobility. Yet underlying the visual spectacle of medieval fashion and appearance was a profound tension, a constant negotiation of the ideal of female beauty and modesty, often influenced by the theological implications of Eve's original sin. The story of Eve, who brought temptation into the world and covered herself after the fall, profoundly shaped medieval ideas about how women should present themselves and how their physical appearance was perceived. On one hand, beauty was recognized as a divine gift, a reflection of God's creation. On the other hand, a woman's beauty was simultaneously seen as a perilous trap, a source of temptation that could lead men to sin, a direct echo of Eve's initial allure to Adam and her role in the fall. This created a complex and often contradictory set of expectations for women. They were expected to be attractive enough to secure a good marriage and bear healthy children, but not so alluring as to invite lust or draw undue attention to themselves. Modesty in dress and demeanor became paramount. While fashion evolved, the underlying principle remained consistent. A woman's attire should not reveal too much of her body, nor should it be excessively elaborate or ostentatious. Sermons frequently cautioned against vanity, rich adornments, and seductive hairstyles, portraying them as tools of the devil, used to tempt men away from piety and towards carnal desires. These warnings directly invoked the image of Eve, who, after her sin, became aware of her nakedness and covered herself. The act of covering was seen as a necessary response to the fallen human condition, particularly for women, whose bodies were considered more inherently tempting. Emphasis on modesty extended beyond clothing to a woman's general comportment. She was expected to be demure, humble, and reserved in public, avoiding loud speech, excessive laughter, or direct eye contact with men who were not her immediate family. Such behaviors were seen as immodest and potentially inciting lust, again reflecting the pervasive fear that women, like Eve, could be instruments of temptation. A woman's honor and reputation were deeply intertwined with her perceived modesty and chastity, and any perceived deviation from these norms could lead to severe social condemnation. Even the popular imagery of the time reflected this tension. While the Virgin Mary represented the pinnacle of purity and humble beauty, Eve, the mother of all living, was often depicted as a figure of both initial innocence and subsequent temptation, her beauty leading to ruin. This dual representation reinforced the idea that female beauty was a double-edged sword, capable of inspiring devotion or inciting sin. For a woman living in 1212, navigating this landscape meant constantly being aware of how her appearance and behavior were perceived. Choices in clothing, her hairstyle, her very posture in public were all scrutinized through a lens that was, at its core, influenced by the ancient story of Eve. Cultural construction of female beauty and modesty was not merely a matter of social etiquette. It was a deeply moral and theological imperative, a constant reminder that women carried the inherited burden of Eve's original temptation, and thus had a unique responsibility to temper their natural allure, lest they lead humanity further astray. Her very body, beautiful or otherwise, was seen as a potential source of moral danger, a living echo of the moment when an apple changed everything.